I like chocolate.
I like it too. Although I only like Cadbury's.
It's the only kind that's worth having. Have you ever thought of doing a biblical theology of chocolate or something like that? Unfortunately, there's not a huge amount in the Bible about it.
No, in the Bible, that's a problem. We wrote a column once about coffee, the religious history of coffee.
Religious history of coffee?
Yeah.
Cool.
So it's really, it's sort of, I mean, there are some sort of ancient Near Eastern references of things that might have been coffee. And then there's the story of coffee's, the discovery of coffee with coffee beans. And then it's a Muslim thing, it's a spiritual thing in Islam, which is why in the medieval period, Pope Clement I don't remember which one he was, he said that it was the devil's drink. Yeah.
Well, I suppose you've got like all these pagan symbols on the Starbucks logo and things like that.
Right.
And Cafe Nero and Persecution Nero kind of thing. But there's nothing much better in my estimation than Cadbury's chocolate and coffee. I think it's amazing. It's heavenly, really. So, well, I suppose there might not be a biblical theology of chocolate, but there's probably a biblical theology of heaven, isn't there?
There sure is. I mean, a lot of people, especially skeptics, will say that the whole point of being a Christian is just to get yourself into heaven. So the reason to be a good person is so that one day you can go to heaven. And there's a lot of eating there. There's a lot of feasting in heaven.
Yeah, that's true. Lamb's Supper kind of thing. And where do you think people get their ideas about heaven from?
Well, with maybe a few notable exceptions, no one's been there.
True.
So really what we're talking about is a projection of the very best of our hopes and desires for ourselves and our world. So if you think of heaven as a high status place, it's where God lives, you can understand why in Isaiah it's a throne room. You can understand why people think that there's feasting there in a world in which food is a scarcity. And especially if you're not wealthy, the idea of there being an ongoing banquet where you can eat as much as you want, that makes a lot of sense. But today that wouldn't make that much sense to people living in Birmingham, because you can actually get food relatively cheaply. So for me, it would have to be a banquet that I can eat as much as I want at, but not gain any weight.
Like a Chinese buffet kind of thing?
Yeah.
Do you think there will be such things as kind of, well, all the good things in life, all the things that we enjoy in life, like friendship and marriage and kind of pets and stuff like that. Do you think there'll be stuff like that in heaven?
Well, so if you're just reading the Bible, it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like it's you, there are probably other people, prophets, Jesus, etc., the apostles, and God, and you're just focused on God. So if you think about what Paul says about heaven and about the resurrection, he says it will have spiritual bodies, and it's not clear if you'll even really have consciousness or what parts of your identity are preserved. But by the time you get to the early modern period, people are starting to find that quite upsetting. Like, they want their friends, they want their family members, they want their pets. And so in colonial America, right on the eve of the American Civil War, we start to find all of these spiritualist writings about heaven in which your family's there, it's just on the other side of a veil, and you have your pets, and you get back your piano that you had that was in your living room, and so heaven becomes this really domestic space. And if you think about that, that's tied to, historically speaking, the rise of the Victorian model of the family, and an increasing interest in that period in your identity is tied not just to your family and those relationships, but also to your material possessions, which is why you get your pets and you get your piano. It's not because they thought pets had souls, it's because they thought these were part of your identity.
And I guess that's why you need the kind of mansion right over the hilltop then, in that sense, isn't it? You've got to store all that stuff. You need more than a room.
You're just keeping stuff now.
If you got a house full of all the good stuff, what about all the rubbish, the old newspapers and the kind of bad memories and things like that?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. So we assume heaven's a good place, and even though Paul doesn't say perfect, we assume that it's going to be perfect. So So then the question is, what is there about our lives now that's integral to who we are that we might think is maybe not wholly good? Right? So you love your family members, you want them there, but do you want to have that fight around the Christmas dinner table for all eternity? So does that get preserved? And what people think is bad is what we see sort of blown up on the big heavenly screen. So in the past, when people thought that men were just better than women, there were some people who thought maybe everyone would be male in heaven. Because like, who would want to be female? So what you're really seeing is when we say the bad stuff, the first thing to ask is, do we just mean what we think is bad, or is that what God thinks is bad?
Okay, I get you. So, what about things like kind of sickness? Because presumably we think that's bad. I think it's bad, and I enjoy being sick. And there is something in the Bible about no more sorrow, no more suffering, no more pain, kind of thing, isn't there? So presumably that's out, I guess. But what about like disability or something like that? So, fascinating but useless fact about me. I was born with 6 fingers on my right hand, a la Anne Boleyn.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So I haven't still got that finger now, but I used to have it. But so do you think I'll get that back at the resurrection?
Well, I think that Mark 9 says that self-initiated acts of bodily modification, if you decided you want to cut off your finger, then you won't get that back.
Right, okay.
But if someone chopped off your leg, then maybe you would get that back. I don't know.
Okay.
I think it's a complicated issue. So full disclosure, I'm a kidney transplant recipient, and I have wondered, do I have to give my uncle his kidney back in heaven? And if I did, would that be bad for me? I don't know. But what I would say is like that experience. So obviously I don't like being sick either. I don't like the pain. I don't like the tiredness. There are all kinds of ways in which having chronic kidney failure is bad for me. But it's also who I am. I would not be me. I certainly would be a theologian, but I would not be me if I hadn't had this experience. This is who I am. So if I want to be me in heaven, then I want this thing that's part of my identity. What I don't want is the things that cause me pain. And that's what Revelation says. God will wipe away every tear from their eye in Revelation 7 and 22. So is there a way that we can distinguish between something that's part of your identity and the things about it that are bad? And I think there is. In disability studies, we call this distinction between impairment and disability. So you have a bodily state that's neutral.
Yeah.
And then it's bad when you come into a situation where you start to experience pain. So if you have a birthmark on your face, there's nothing wrong with that until kids make fun of you at school.
Right, yeah.
That's when it's bad. And so if you could get rid of that, then you wouldn't have to change the impairment. And I think we can sort of see the model for this in just the resurrected body of Jesus in the Gospels. So he had wounds when he was crucified, but I think when he's resurrected that the marks of the nails are sort of the beginning of scars. So we can see the preservation of something integral to Jesus' identity. In fact, this is how the apostles identify him in John, right? This is how Thomas is sure this is him. But there's a transformation too. And if you look in the ancient world, scars can be understood very positively. And so I think what we find is the preservation of things that are integral to our identity, but a kind of transformation of those, and that is the language Paul uses, that makes them not have pain.
Which is pretty cool, isn't it? Because I've often wondered how I'd recognise people in heaven. I mean, presumably it'd be fairly easy to recognise Jesus because of where he'll be sat and things like that. But how would you recognise somebody like Isaiah? And I mean, I'm looking forward to meeting Isaiah. He's kind of one of the presuming I get to heaven, and presuming he does. He's kind of. I wrote my PhD about him. I think he's a cool guy. Looking forward to meeting him. But how will I know? I mean, presumably there won't be name badges or something like that.
That's a really interesting question. Will there be name badges? Will you, even when you're in heaven and you're in the presence of God, will you even be focused on your own consciousness and identity in that context? Much less the identity of other people. And we now think that's really important, but we don't know that that's important to God. And so I think the really important thing to think about when we're talking about theology, and you better hope that when you get to heaven that Isaiah doesn't like break open a copy of your dissertation and start criticising it.
Yeah, that would be slightly unfortunate, wouldn't it?
I think the important thing, given that we don't know what heaven is like, the important thing is how do we use our ideas about heaven to improve society here, given that we sort of have a mandate to create the kingdom of heaven now, and how do we ensure that that theology isn't harming people by setting up some kind of hierarchy of better and worse bodies.
Sounds pretty cool to me.